This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. We're standing inside the city garage where a $100 million deal was just announced between city officials and Sagamore Development. Sagamore, which is run by Under Armour CEO Kevin Plank, has asked for a controversial $500 million tax break to build Port Covington. But some city officials, like Councilman Carl Stokes, have argued that Kevin Plank needs to give more. And now both sides say that indeed has occurred. The deal includes guarantees to employ city residents, invest in community projects, and increase the percentage of affordable housing to be built for the project itself. It's an array of givebacks city officials say makes the deal not just more palatable for the public, but equitable.
So my office began working with Sagamore Development months ago to make sure that all of the people of Baltimore benefited from Port Covington, from this transformative development project for the city of Baltimore. The initial MOUs were only the baseline, and I've been steadfast in following through on the promise I made in April to fully address the concerns that were raised through this new agreement. By working collaboratively with Sagamore residents and our elected officials, I have fulfilled that promise to you.
Sagamore knows from the start, I said, this deal will not go anywhere unless you get the people in the room and come out with a deal that's good for Baltimore, and they've done that.
While I'm not a singer, I feel like I want to break out in song. So I'm going to. Don't you feel a brand new day? Don't you feel a brand new day? Hey, 1978.
So, Stephen, give us some of the details on this deal.
Well, you know, it's one of the deal constructed around sort of givebacks to the community, investment in community-based projects, a guarantee to build at least 60% more, actually 20% more affordable housing. Interestingly, 40% of that affordable housing can be built anywhere in the city. A guarantee of a certain wage, $23 an hour, for people who are employed here, who live in the city. A guarantee that 50% of the new jobs that are created here will go to people who work and live in the city, and other various amounts of money dedicated to projects around the city and community initiatives. Now, the details were not, it wasn't each dollar amount was assigned to something specific, but it was generalized targets, which will ultimately, they claim, add up to $100 million for the project going forward. That's sort of a give back. So that's the total of the deal right now, sort of the outline that they sketched out for us.
So, Stephen, you covered the last big tax break, a $107 million deal for Michael Beatty's Harbor Point. How is this different?
Well, Michael Beatty really didn't give back too much. He gave $2.5 million to Living Classroom. The same organization you see here today, Build, had asked for money for affordable housing, and he rejected that claim. So technically, Sagamore came back to the table with a little bit more than Harbor Point did. And it's interesting because right now, Harbor Point, they've actually had to increase the amount of money they're spending on the TIP, and there's questions about that project. But nevertheless, this is definitely more substantive, and they're making a much bigger deal out of it. So it's something that, you know, we'll have to see what happens, but it certainly is an improvement. You can't say it's not an improvement from the Harbor Point deal that was made just 3 years ago for $107 million, as you pointed out. So it was still a big deal, but so this is an improvement depending on what happens.
Under Armour is unaffordable. Under Armour is unaffordable. Under Armour is unaffordable.
The last time we were here at City Garage, there was actually a disruption. It was a 1,000 Friends meeting where they were discussing Port Covington, having dinner, having wine, having drinks, showing off the City Garage. There was a protest that interrupted the entire proceeding. Now, how much do you think that the protesters coming down to the City Garage, as well as going to the TIF hearings, how much impact do you think they had? Do you think this is the reason why they've renegotiated this deal?
I think there are two reasons. I think the protesters did have an impact because I think, last in the Harbor Point there was some protests, but it wasn't as concentrated. And I think the actions that took place that sort of embarrassed the people at Sagamore had a big impact. And I do think it was big. The other thing was that, we have just experienced Freddie Gray, the death of Freddie Gray, and the sort of national spotlight on the abject poverty and the division, class divisions in Baltimore, and the division between the poor part of the city and the rich part of the city. And that has been front and center. And it seems to me glaring to have a situation where you're going to give a $500 million tax break to a alleged billionaire when you have entrenched poverty and many of the issues that people have been talking about have not been addressed. So I think that was a big part of it, was just simply, it was embarrassing to the city. And then number three, I think Councilman Carl Stokes, this bill was in his committee. It had to go through his committee, Taxation and Finance, to get out and to be approved. And I think Carl Stokes, which interestingly he was not here today, yes. I think Carl Stokes had a lot to do with it, because I think his basic stated philosophy was it wasn't going to happen again on his watch. He said, I'll just wait. We can wait till next council session. I'll be out of here. So I think that too, and the urgency of trying to get this done with this council had a lot to do with it too.
So a TIF or tax increment financing deal means that the city would have to forego collecting future property taxes. Mm-hmm. Do you think this deal is still worth it? Isn't the city actually losing millions of dollars?
Well, that's what's interesting about this whole thing. There's this celebration of $100 million. But let's remember that the city is going to have to forego almost all the property taxes generated by these new properties for decades. And the $535 million is not really the figure. It's about $625 million in bonds that are authorized. And then if you include interest on those bonds, which basically people don't understand, the amount of money, the developer gets it right up front. So the city has to sell bonds to give them all this, because all the future tax revenues are calculated, and they have to get the tax money up front. So the bonds are actually $1.2 billion once they're paid off. So $1.2 billion is actually a year and a half of the entire property tax collection of the entire city. So it's a major sacrifice. I mean, $100 million, depending on how it shakes out, is certainly nothing to sneeze at. But when you put it against the amount of money the city is foregoing in property taxes that everybody has to pay, you're talking about a huge cost-benefit analysis that I don't think really emerges in the calculus of the politics that we've seen today. I think people sort of like the City Hotel, which has lost money consistently, and other deals that I've seen happen. There's this euphoria about, we struck this deal, we get a little bit back. Well, they're giving much less than they're getting. They're getting $1.2 billion. They're giving $100 million. Who wouldn't make that kind of deal? That's a good deal for the developers.
So my final question is, what type of precedent does this set for these kind of deals?
Well, I mean, I think what you saw with the Harbor Point in 2013 was $100 million. It was the biggest TIF in city history, and there was a lot of controversy about it. But when it went through and sailed through, I think it set a precedent where people at Port Covington said, well, if they can get $100 million, we should be able to get $500 million. And I think that every developer now who comes into the city with any project that is over a certain size is going to look at this and say, well, my God, they gave them $500 million. I should at least get $50 million or $100 million. And we have other TIFs. We have the Poppleton TIF, which is the University of Maryland Biotech Park, where they're giving $18 million to a firm that is building office space, not even building infrastructure. I think at this point, the cat's, it is literally at a point where everyone who comes in here, regardless of what type of development they're doing, are going to seek money because they're going to say, look what they did for Kevin Plank.
Now, everyone who has been negotiating this Port Covington deal, whether it is city officials or Sagamore Development, the assumption has been that Port Covington will be a success when Sagamore Development builds it. But isn't this the first time that Sagamore has actually taken on a project like this?
This is a massive scale development. That's an excellent question. This is something that, this is in the upper echelon of development. You're talking about a 30-year, supposedly $4 billion project with, I think it's 4 million square feet of office space. It's just incredibly complex building. And, you've got a city where the vacancy rates for commercial development, for example, are 18-20%. I've talked to people, there is literally no demand for commercial office space. You've got apartment buildings that have been built that are like 20-30% occupied on Calvert Street, on St. Paul Street. So you're kind of basing this whole project on people that don't really exist. What usually happens, what's happening in Harbor East, is it shuffles the table and people come from Midtown and they move over to Harbor East because it's more interesting. And I don't know, the main thing that Baltimore needs to do, right, is to bring people in. But why would this be any different from any other situation? Why does this suddenly make, you haven't lowered the tax rate, you still have some of the structural problems like crime and bad schools.
Right.
If it doesn't improve that, I don't see how building something new brings more people in.
This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland.